Dear ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to say a few words about NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Although I'm making this short speech in English, it's actually not directed at Anglo-Saxon nations. Well, I don't want to say that our American or British friends shouldn't listen to them, but the problem is that they, generally speaking, don't care about this topic. Some of them do, but the majority don't. And this little speech is predominantly for those who belong to the nations that have been cursed by living next to Russia, especially for those who live to the west and southwest of the borders of Russian Federation. Why am I taking the liberty of talking about that to you? Well, first, speaking about NATO, I should say that I know a little bit about that organization because I used to work within some NATO projects when I lived in Germany in the early 90s and later in Canada in the mid 90s and late 90s. I was involved in some NATO projects as well, and also knew some decision makers over there. Another question, why would I care about western and southwestern neighbors of Russia? Well, because some of my ancestors, some of my family, belong not only to the German people, but also to at least four peoples living to the west and southwest of Russia. By the way, among my ancestors there were no Ukrainians, no Russians, and no Jews, but that doesn't matter. There were some other ethnicities. And I have to make this little speech in English because English is lingua franca that should unite all of us, at least the people belonging to the younger generation, who do not understand Russian anymore, but who hopefully learned some English. Why did I say that it's a curse to live next to Russia? Because if we look at the history, and also if we look at some contemporary events, they all imply proof that living next to Russia means facing wars, invasions, acts of terror, mass murders, brutal murders by the way, deportations, the destruction of property, the destruction of architecture, and even of nature. Water, forests, mountains, you name it. Some pacifists would say that, well, those problems can be resolved through negotiations. Well, negotiations, of course, should be taken into consideration, but you will never have any success if you keep begging imperialists for peace. Imperialists, sociopaths, will never grant you peace. The only thing they understand is brutal force, military force. And the principle one should adhere is, I don't want to fight with you, but I will if I am forced to. What does that mean? It means that western and southwestern neighbors of Russia need to be united. Of course, the best way to unite is to get united under the umbrella of NATO. I am definitely a pro-NATO person, although I must say that NATO, as any organization, is not free of certain drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is the diversity of NATO. Too many different nations are the members of NATO. It doesn't mean, God forbid, I don't want to say that some of those nations should be excluded, God forbid. But we should understand that there are certain booby traps in cooperation between nations that are so different. By the way, do you know why the strongest army in Europe was the German army at least during the first half of the 20th century. I hope you're not going to argue with me about that. The experience has shown that the German army was the best, if we forget about the ideologies of Nazism, etc. Why was it the best and the most effective? That's very simple. Because military units of the German army consisted of young men from the same village, the same farm, the same neighborhood. They knew each other very well, they knew what to expect from each other, and they even cared about each other. To some extent, of course. Of course, at the end of the Second World War, everything was mixed up and messed up, but at the beginning, the effectiveness was reached by the fact that I've already mentioned. The diversity of NATO sometimes plays really bad jokes with its operations. The peacekeeping operations in the former Yugoslavia and in Afghanistan have all amply proven that. But, nevertheless, that's something we have to live with. You should keep that in mind and try to somehow rectify what can be rectified. And that's not the worst problem. The worst problem is that, before I mention it, I'll mention one ancient proverb. The old proverb that tells us that a group of sheep under the command of a lion is way more effective than a group of lions under the command of a sheep. You know what I mean, right? I think you do. Unfortunately, most of the NATO nations are led by not exactly the right people, to put it mildly. That is a serious problem, but this problem can be resolved. And the proof of what I've said right now was the NATO summit of 2008, where the doors of North Atlantic Treaty Organization were closed for Ukraine and Georgia. And you know who was behind that. It was Angela Merkel of Germany and her French colleague who were behind that. Who is Angela Merkel, you know? I made a couple of videos about that. I'm not going to repeat it. And it's no wonder that she was acting in the best interests of the Kremlin. Right now, the situation is even worse. And by the way, let me tell you, Ukraine and Georgia were not the ideal countries to become NATO member states. But there were other countries that already were accepted into NATO that were not better. I'm not going to mention that. Nomina sunt adiose, you know. And the problem of useful idiots and direct agents of the Kremlin is a very serious problem. But this problem can be resolved. So being part of NATO is crucial. Crucial for those nations that are already in NATO and for those who need to be there. Here I mean first and foremost Georgia and Ukraine, and not only them. There are some other countries that are neighbors of Russia but not in NATO yet. That's one thing. Another thing, parallelly to NATO, not in contrast with NATO, not in conflict with NATO, but parallelly, there should be formed an alternative alliance of such countries as Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Georgia, Azerbaijan, maybe also Armenia, Moldova, and at some point even Belarus when Belarus gets a new government. Not Lukashenko's government, but something more appropriate. This idea is not new, it's not my idea. This idea was actually promoted by Joseph Pilsudski, one of the great military leaders of Poland in the early 20th century. Intermarium, that was the new military bloc that he tried to form that would include more or less the countries which I already mentioned. That is something we all have to think about, and again, this new military alliance should not be in any conflict or contrast with NATO. It shouldn't have any contradictions with it, but it's important as a serious backup. In my humble opinion, of course. Maybe I'm wrong. You never know. That's actually everything I wanted to say today. Thank you for listening to this and have a lovely rest of the summer. Bye bye.